On the morning of September 11th, 1851, a man stood at the top of a narrow staircase inside a small stone farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. He gripped a rifle in his hands and stared down at the armed men who had just forced their way through his door. These men had traveled from Maryland with federal warrants and a deputy marshal at their side. They had come to take back what they called their property. But William Parker, the man at the top of those stairs, had other plans. He had escaped from slavery 12 years earlier, and he had spent those years building something extraordinary in this little farming community called Christiana. He had built a network of protection, a system of intelligence, and a community of people who had resolved together that they would never allow another person to be dragged back into bondage. And on this particular morning, with his wife beside him and his neighbors rushing toward the sound of her horn, William Parker was about to make a choice that would echo through history and help bring a nation to the brink of civil war. To understand what happened on that September morning, we need to go back to where William Parker's story truly began, on a plantation called Rowdown in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. Parker was born there around 1822, enslaved from his first breath. His mother was a woman named Louisa Sims, and she died when William was very young. His father remains unknown, though Parker himself was of mixed race, suggesting his father was likely a white man. After his mother's death, the boy was raised largely by his grandmother, who worked as a cook in the main house. She loved him, but her work kept her away from the slave quarters most of the time, and young William grew up knowing the particular loneliness of a child who belongs to no one but the person who owns him. The plantation belonged to Major William Brogdon, a veteran of the American Revolution and one of the wealthy landowners in the region. At the time of his death in 1824, property inventories indicated that Brogdon owned upwards of 80 enslaved people. When the major died, his property was divided between his sons, and William Parker became the property of David Brogdon, whom the enslaved people called Master Mac. Parker would later write in his memoir that the Brogdons were not particularly brutal masters in the physical sense. They did not regularly beat their enslaved workers or subject them to the daily violence that characterized life on some other plantations. But there was another form of terror that hung over Rowdown, and it was the terror that shaped William Parker's entire childhood. The Brogdons sold slaves. They sold them regularly, sometimes 6 or 7 at a time, and every enslaved person on that plantation lived with the knowledge that any day might be the day they were torn from everyone they loved and sent deeper into the nightmare of the American South. Parker remembered one morning in particular when he was about 10 or 11 years old. He saw the slave traders arrive, and he knew what that meant. He grabbed his friend Levi Storax, a boy about his own age, and the two of them ran into the woods to hide. Crouched there among the trees, Parker told Levi that they should run away to the free states, where they could never be sold. Levi was more cautious. He worried they would be caught. They went back to the plantation that day, and life continued as it had before. But Parker never forgot that moment in the woods, and he never stopped thinking about freedom. As the years passed, Parker watched as enslaved people he knew were sold away one by one. Then Levi himself was sold, deceived into delivering a letter to a man who turned out to be his new owner. Parker's best friend was gone, carried away into a fate that no one on the plantation would ever learn the truth of. For Parker, this was the final confirmation of what he had always known. He would not stay. He would not wait to be sold. He would take his freedom with his own hands, or he would die trying. The moment came when Parker was about 17 years old. His master, David Brogdon, attempted to beat him one day after Parker refused to work in the rain. Parker fought back. He injured Brogdon in the struggle and knew immediately that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. That night in 1839, William Parker and his older brother Charles made their decision. They were going to run. The brothers fled north toward Baltimore, where they hid for about a week in an abandoned warehouse. They dirtied their clothes to look like laborers and moved carefully through the city, blending in as best they could with Baltimore's large population of free black people. From Baltimore, they continued north to York, Pennsylvania, where they received help from Underground Railroad station master William Goodrich. But York was still too close to the border, still too dangerous. The slave catchers worked these areas aggressively, and local people warned the brothers to keep moving. They crossed the Susquehanna River into Columbia and eventually made their way to Lancaster County, where they finally began to believe that they might actually be free. But freedom in Pennsylvania was not quite what William Parker had imagined it would be. He found work as a farm laborer, but the jobs were scarce and the pay was poor. He competed with Irish immigrants for the lowest positions available. And worse, he quickly learned that Lancaster County, despite being in a free state, was not safe. The area was only about 20 miles north of the Maryland border, and slave catchers crossed that border regularly. They came for escaped slaves, and they came for free black people too, kidnapping them and selling them into slavery in the Deep South, where demand for enslaved labor was so high that the catchers were willing to take the risk. Among the most notorious of these groups was the Gap Gang, a roving band of slave catchers who patrolled the region around Gap, Pennsylvania, looking for anyone they could capture for bounty. They operated with impunity, breaking into homes, seizing men, women, and children, and dragging them across state lines before anyone could intervene. For the black residents of Lancaster County, whether they were escaped slaves or people who had been born free, life was lived under a constant shadow of fear. William Parker could have done what many others did. He could have kept his head down, stayed quiet, and tried to avoid attention. Instead, he made a different choice entirely. Around 1841, Parker joined with several other black men in the area to form what they called an organization for mutual protection against slaveholders and kidnappers. Their resolution was clear and uncompromising. They would prevent any of their brethren from being taken back into slavery at the risk of their own lives. This was not the pacifist abolitionism of the Quakers who lived throughout the region. The Quakers were allies, and many of them ran stations on the Underground Railroad, but they were committed to nonviolent resistance. Parker and his organization took a different approach. They used force. They developed an intelligence network to warn each other when slave catchers were in the area. They responded quickly when someone was taken, intercepting the kidnappers before they could cross back into slave territory. And when necessary, they fought. Over the course of the next 12 years, William Parker became one of the most respected and feared men in the black community of Lancaster County. One local Quaker Underground Railroad station master described him as bold as a lion, the kindest of men, and the warmest and most steadfast of friends. Parker himself was shot in the ankle during one rescue mission, but continued his work without hesitation. He led multiple operations to free people who had been captured, and, by his own account, several of the kidnappers died from the injuries they sustained in confrontations with his organization. During this time, Parker attended an anti-slavery meeting where he heard two men speak who would shape his understanding of what this fight was really about. One was William Lloyd Garrison, the famous white abolitionist who edited The Liberator and preached a doctrine of moral suasion and nonviolent resistance. The other was Frederick Douglass, who had escaped from slavery in Maryland and was becoming the most powerful black voice in the abolitionist movement. Parker had actually known Douglass years earlier, when both of them had been enslaved in Maryland. Now they met again as free men, united in their opposition to the system that had held them both in chains. Parker was deeply moved by Douglass's words, and he embraced the cause of abolition with renewed determination. He married a woman named Eliza Ann Elizabeth Howard, herself an escaped slave from Maryland, whose own experience of slavery, as Parker later wrote, had been much more bitter than his own. Eliza's mother, brother, and sisters had also escaped and were living in the Lancaster area. By 1851, William and Eliza had 3 children together, and they were living in a 2-story stone house just outside of Christiana, which they rented from a Quaker farmer named Levi Pownall. Living with them were Eliza's sister Hannah and her husband Alexander Pinckney, as well as another escaped slave from Maryland named Abraham Johnson. The house had become something of a safe haven, a place where escaped slaves could find shelter and protection while they made their way further north or decided to settle in the area. And it was to this house, in September of 1851, that 4 young men came seeking refuge. Their names were Noah Bewley, Nelson Ford, George Hammond, and Joshua Hammond, and they had escaped from a farm in Baltimore County, Maryland, 2 years earlier. They had fled after stealing 5 bushels of wheat from their enslaver, a man named Edward Gorsuch, and selling it to raise money for their journey north. When Gorsuch discovered the theft and learned that his slaves were responsible, the 4 men knew that punishment would be severe. They ran, and they did not stop until they reached Lancaster County. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had changed everything. This new federal law required citizens in free states to assist in the capture of escaped slaves, or face fines up to $1,000 and potential imprisonment. It stripped accused fugitives of the right to testify in their own defense and denied them jury trials. Federal commissioners who heard fugitive slave cases received $10 if they ruled in favor of the slaveholder, but only $5 if they ruled for the accused, creating a financial incentive to send people back into bondage. The law turned every resident of the North into a potential participant in the slave system, whether they wanted to participate or not. For Edward Gorsuch, the Fugitive Slave Act was an opportunity. For 2 years, he had been searching for the men who had escaped from his farm. Now he finally had intelligence that they were living near Christiana, Pennsylvania, working as laborers on local farms. On September 8, 1851, Gorsuch took a train from Baltimore to Philadelphia, where he obtained federal warrants for the arrest of the 4 men. He was assigned a deputy federal marshal named Henry Klein to assist with the operation, and he hired 2 Philadelphia police officers to provide additional support. But Gorsuch did not know that his movements were being watched. In Philadelphia, the abolitionist William Still ran a secret committee that monitored the Federal Fugitive Slave Office and tracked the activities of suspected slave catchers. One of Still's agents, a man named Samuel Williams, observed Gorsuch obtaining his warrants and followed the group as they boarded a train heading west toward Lancaster County. Williams sent word ahead to the black community around Christiana that slave catchers were coming. Gorsuch's party arrived in the area around Christiana on the night of September 10th. Along with the deputy marshal, Gorsuch had assembled a posse that included his son Dickinson, his nephew Thomas Pierce, and several other men from Maryland. They spent the night at a location about 15 miles from Christiana, planning to approach the Parker house at dawn, when they believed they could catch the fugitives by surprise. But there would be no surprise. The intelligence network that Parker had built over 12 years was working exactly as intended. Word had spread through the black community that slaveholders were in the area. When Gorsuch and his men approached the Parker house in the early morning hours of September 11, 1851, they found the occupants ready and waiting. One of the men Gorsuch was seeking, a man known locally as Joshua Kite, was leaving the house early that morning to go to work. He spotted his former master approaching and ran back inside, shouting the alarm. Parker and the other men in the house retreated upstairs, and when Gorsuch and his party pushed through the door and started up the narrow staircase, they found themselves staring up at the barrel of William Parker's rifle. What followed was hours of tense confrontation. Deputy Marshal Klein read the federal warrant aloud, asserting the authority of the United States government to take possession of the accused fugitives. Parker was unimpressed. By his own account, he told Klein that he did not care for him or the United States. Gorsuch, who was in his mid-50s and had traveled a long way to reclaim what he considered his property, was equally unmoved. He reportedly declared that he would have his property, or he would breakfast in hell. The two sides sparred, exchanging Bible verses and arguments about rights and law and justice. Parker suggested that if Gorsuch was looking for property that belonged to him, he should check the house for tables and chairs, or look in the barn for livestock. This was not property, Parker was saying. These were men. As the standoff continued, Eliza Parker went to an upstairs window and began blowing a horn. This was the signal that had been established throughout the community, the call for help that meant slave catchers were present and armed resistance was needed. The men in Gorsuch's party fired at the window, trying to silence her, but Eliza ducked the shots and kept blowing. The sound carried across the fields to neighboring farms, and people began to respond. Within hours, somewhere between 50 and 100 armed black men and women had gathered at the Parker house. Some brought guns. Others carried corn cutters, axes, clubs, and whatever weapons they could find. Several white neighbors also arrived at the scene, including a Quaker miller named Castner Hanway and a farmer named Elijah Lewis. These men were not armed and were not there to participate in any violence. They came because they had heard there was trouble, and they tried to convince Gorsuch to leave before the situation escalated further. But Edward Gorsuch would not leave. He had come too far and waited too long to go home empty-handed. The exact sequence of what happened next is unclear, as accounts from survivors differed in important details. But at some point, the confrontation turned violent. Shots were fired. The crowd surged forward. One of the men Gorsuch had come to reclaim, likely Joshua Hammond, struck his former master with a gun and continued to beat him as he fell. Other members of the crowd joined the assault. Women came down from the house wielding sticks and stones. When the chaos subsided, Edward Gorsuch lay dead on the ground outside the Parker house. His son Dickinson had been shot and severely wounded. His nephew and several other members of the posse were injured. The deputy marshal and the rest of the slaveholders' party fled for their lives. William Parker and the other black men most directly involved in the confrontation immediately began preparing to escape. They knew what would happen next. They knew that a white slaveholder had been killed by black men, and they knew that no jury in America would see that as anything other than murder. That same night, Parker, his brother-in-law Alexander Pinckney, and Abraham Johnson left Christiana, heading north toward Canada. They left their wives and children behind, gambling that the women would not be held responsible for the violence. They were largely correct in this calculation. Eliza Parker and Hannah Pinckney were arrested in the days that followed, but they were eventually released without being charged. The three men traveled for 9 days, moving through the Underground Railroad network that stretched from Pennsylvania to the Canadian border. On September 20th, they arrived in Rochester, New York, where they found shelter at the home of Frederick Douglass. It was the third time that Parker and Douglass's paths had crossed, but this meeting was different from the others. This time, Parker came not as a listener at an abolitionist meeting, but as a man who had just done what Douglass had been preaching about for years. He had resisted. He had fought. He had refused to allow the Fugitive Slave Act to be enforced in his community. Douglass was deeply moved by Parker's story and by his courage. He later wrote that he could not look upon these men as murderers. To him, they were heroic defenders of the just rights of man against man, stealers and murderers. Douglass arranged for Parker and his companions to take a ferry across the Niagara River to Canada. As Parker boarded the boat, he presented Douglass with a gift, the pistol that had fallen from Edward Gorsuch's hand when he died. It was, Parker said, a token of gratitude and a memento of the battle they had fought together in the cause of liberty. Back in Pennsylvania, the reaction to what newspapers were calling the Christiana Riot was immediate and severe. President Millard Fillmore dispatched a company of United States Marines and 40 Philadelphia police officers to the area to apprehend everyone involved. Local authorities, along with groups of angry Marylanders and professional slave catchers, swept through the black community of Christiana, kicking in doors and arresting anyone who might have been connected to the resistance. By the time the roundups were complete, 141 people had been arrested. The federal government decided to make an example of the Christiana defendants. Rather than charging them with murder or riot, prosecutors charged them with treason against the United States. This was an extraordinary escalation. The government was arguing that refusing to assist in the capture of fugitive slaves and actively resisting their return constituted levying war against the nation itself. If convicted, the defendants could face execution. 41 men were ultimately indicted, including William Parker, who was charged in absentia since he had already escaped to Canada. But the prosecutors faced a strategic problem. They believed, apparently sincerely, that a black man could not have been the leader of such a well-organized resistance. They assumed that the real mastermind must have been one of the white men present at the scene. So they decided to try Kastner Hanway first, the Quaker miller who had arrived on horseback that morning and had told the slaveholders to leave. The trial began on November 24, 1851, in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the same building where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 75 years earlier. The irony was not lost on the defendants' supporters. Supreme Court Justice Robert Greer presided over the case alongside U.S. District Judge John Kane. The defense team was led by some of the most prominent attorneys in Pennsylvania, including the fiery abolitionist Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. The prosecution called witnesses to establish that Hanway had been present at the scene, that he had failed to assist the deputy marshal, and that his presence had emboldened the black resistors. But the defense systematically dismantled the government's case. Deputy Marshal Henry Klein, the star prosecution witness, was caught in so many lies during cross-examination that he was later indicted for perjury. The defense attorneys argued that whatever had happened at Christiana, it did not meet the constitutional definition of treason, which required actually levying war against the United States. Armed with corn cutters, clubs, and a few muskets, one defense attorney said sarcastically, and headed by a miller in a felt hat, without a coat, without arms, and mounted on a sorrel nag, they levied war against the United States. Blessed be God that our Union has survived the shock. The trial lasted 18 days, and when it ended, the jury needed only 15 minutes to reach a verdict. Castner Hanway was not guilty of treason. The ICE government, having staked everything on this first trial, decided not to proceed with the others. On December 17, 1851, 6 days after Hanway's acquittal, the remaining treason charges were dismissed. The state murder charges against the black defendants were dropped shortly thereafter, when prosecutors realized they could not identify with certainty who had actually struck the blows that killed Edward Gorsuch. In the end, no one was ever convicted of any crime related to Edward Gorsuch's death. The largest treason trial in American history up to that point ended with a complete victory for the defense. The reactions to this outcome varied dramatically depending on which side of the slavery debate you stood on. In the North, abolitionists celebrated the verdict as a triumph of liberty over the slave power. Frederick Douglass would later write that the events at Christiana, more than all else, destroyed the fugitive slave law. The resistance and the subsequent acquittals had demonstrated that the law could not be enforced in communities that refused to accept it. A newspaper in Lancaster proclaimed that the first blow had been struck in what would become a civil war. In the South, the verdict was met with outrage. Slaveholders saw Gorsuch's death as murder, and his killer's escape as a grotesque miscarriage of justice. Maryland's governor warned that when the treason stalks unpunished through the halls of justice, the nation can judge of the probable remoteness of violent breakup. The Christiana resistance became one of the incidents that convinced Southern leaders that their interests could never be protected within the Union, another step on the road that would lead to secession and war. Meanwhile, William Parker was building a new life in Canada. He and his family settled in Buxton, Ontario, a community that had been established in 1849 by Reverend William King, a Scots-Irish Presbyterian minister and reformed slaveholder who had purchased 9,000 acres of land for resettlement by refugees from American slavery. Within a few years, more than 130 families lived in Buxton, having cleared land, built houses, and established farms, schools, and churches. Parker arrived illiterate, but in Canada he did what slavery had never allowed him to do. He learned to read and write. He attended the school at Buxton and acquired the education that had been denied to him for his entire life. With these new skills, he became the Kent County correspondent for Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star, writing about life in the Black Canadian community and continuing to advocate for the cause of abolition. Parker also became active in local politics. He was elected to the Court of Arbitration, the governing body of the Buxton settlement, which was a self-governing community where residents made their own decisions about how to organize their lives. He was later elected to the Raleigh Township Council, and he was repeatedly re-elected by both black and white voters. The man who had been born as property in Maryland had become a respected citizen and community leader in Canada. Eliza Parker joined her husband in Buxton about 2 months after his escape, having narrowly avoided capture on several occasions during her own journey north. The couple had more children in Canada, eventually raising a family of 10. They purchased a 50-acre lot of land and built a life that would have been unimaginable to the boy who had hidden in the woods on Rowdown Plantation, dreaming of freedom. Parker's fame followed him to Canada. Frederick Douglass visited Buxton in 1854 and praised the settlement as proof that black people could live and live well without a master. When speaking about the Christiana resistance, Douglass declared that Parker and his noble band, who defended themselves from the kidnapper with prayers and pistols, were entitled to the honor of making the first successful resistance to the Fugitive Slave Bill. In 1866, Parker's story reached an even wider audience when his memoir, The Freedman's Story, was published in 2 parts in the Atlantic Monthly magazine. The narrative was edited by an unknown white editor identified only as E.K., but the voice and the experiences described were Parker's own. The memoir provided the only first-hand account from a combatant inside the house during the Christiana resistance and offered a powerful testimony about life under slavery and the determination of black Americans to resist their oppression. Parker returned to Christiana for the first time in 1872, more than 2 decades after the events that had made him famous. He visited old friends and was honored as a guest at the commencement ceremony of Lincoln University, a historically black college located about 15 miles south of Christiana. The university had been founded in 1854, inspired in part by the Christiana resistance and the broader movement for black freedom and education. The later years of Parker's life are less well documented, and some details remain uncertain. According to some accounts, he returned to the United States at some point after the Civil War. He died on April 14, 1891, at the age of approximately 70, and was buried with Masonic honors. His wife Eliza survived him, living until 1899. Some of their descendants still live in Canada today. What are we to make of William Parker and the events of September 11, 1851? In his own time, Parker was called both a hero and a murderer, depending on who was speaking. He was a man who refused to accept the legitimacy of laws that treated human beings as property, and he was willing to use violence to defend that principle. This makes him an uncomfortable figure for some, then and now. The question of when violence is justified in the pursuit of justice is one that has never been fully resolved, and Parker's story forces us to confront it directly. But we can say this with certainty. William Parker understood something that many people in his era refused to accept. He understood that slavery was not a political issue to be debated and compromised over in the halls of Congress. It was a daily reality of violence, terror, and dehumanization that was being inflicted on millions of people. He understood that the Fugitive Slave Act was not a neutral law that deserved respect, but an instrument of oppression that demanded resistance. And he understood that freedom for black people in America was not going to be given as a gift by benevolent white people. It was going to be taken, by force if necessary, by the people who had been denied it. Parker said that he had earned his rights as a freeman with his own right arm. This was not a metaphor. He meant it literally. He had fought for his freedom, fought for the freedom of others, and was willing to kill and to die in that fight. In a nation that celebrates revolution and armed resistance when it is carried out by white men against British tyranny, Parker's resistance poses a fundamental challenge. If the American Revolution was justified, if Patrick Henry was right to say, "Give me liberty or give me death," then on what grounds can we condemn William Parker for demanding the same thing? The Christiana resistance did not end slavery. That would require a civil war that cost over 600,000 lives. But it helped to bring that war closer by demonstrating that the Fugitive Slave Act could not be peacefully enforced, by radicalizing opinion in both the North and the South, and by proving that Black Americans would not accept their enslavement passively. Frederick Douglass was right to say that the events at Christiana did more than anything else to destroy the fugitive slave law. The law remained on the books until the Civil War, but after Christiana, everyone knew that it was unenforceable in any community with a significant Black population willing to resist. Today, the stone farmhouse where William Parker made his stand no longer exists. It was demolished decades ago, and the site is marked only by a historical plaque. But the legacy of what happened there endures. In 1911, 60 years after the resistance, a memorial ceremony was held in Christiana with descendants of both the Parker family and the Gorsuch family in attendance. 2 commemorative medals were struck. One featured a portrait of Millard Fillmore, the president who signed the Fugitive Slave Act, and was inscribed in memory of Edward Gorsuch. The other featured a portrait of Abraham Lincoln and was inscribed with the name of Peter Woods, one of the Black men who had been indicted for treason and later served as a soldier in the Union Army during the Civil War. Those 2 medals, representing law on one side and liberty on the other, capture something essential about the conflict that defined American life in the decade before the Civil War. Edward Gorsuch believed he was enforcing the law. William Parker believed he was defending liberty. Both were right, in a sense, but only one of them was fighting for a principle that we can honor today. The law that Gorsuch died enforcing was a law designed to perpetuate one of the greatest crimes in human history. The liberty that Parker defended was the most basic right that any human being possesses: the right to be free. William Parker spent most of his life as a man without a country. He was born in a nation that classified him as property. He escaped to a state that could not protect him. He fled to another country where he was finally able to live as a free man. But in his resistance, in his refusal to bow to an unjust law, in his willingness to sacrifice everything for the principle of human freedom, he helped to create the conditions that would eventually make this country a place where no person could legally be held as a slave. The man who learned to fight as a boy so he could get close to the fire, the man who watched his friend Levi sold away and vowed never to let it happen to him, the man who stood at the top of those stairs and told a slaveholder and a federal marshal that he did not care for them or the United States. That man is part of the story of how we became who we are. William Parker was not a perfect man. He was not a saint. He was a man who lived in an impossible situation and made the choice that his conscience demanded. And because he made that choice, because he and people like him were willing to fight, America is a better country today than it would have been if they had surrendered. Some people are remembered because they held great power. Others are remembered because they told great powers that their authority meant nothing. William Parker belongs to the second category. He was, as one Quaker who knew him said, as bold as a lion. And on a September morning in 1851, in a small stone house in a rural Pennsylvania farming community, that boldness changed history.